Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show how to capture a very high level of realism without actually having to put in lots of individual details. Now sometimes there may be a subject that is a little bit softer in its appearance. In this situation, this seal, the fur was very wet, so it had a smoother, slightly shinier look to that fur. So this is one of those situations where if I had forced more individual details throughout this layering process, this fur would look drier than I actually want to create in this piece. So this is something that I want to focus this video on, and I'm going to pack lots of individual tips that can be applied to many other drawings. So starting off with a good base foundation, I am using a eye makeup applicator and applying graphite powder to hint at my lights and my darks. Now for this, I want to be making sure that I don't have any harsh edges. So here I'm going to be potentially easing off of that pressure if I want to create a slightly lighter version of that shadow, or I'm going to apply more pressure if I want to add more of the graphite powder in that area. Now one thing I want to be doing at this stage is making sure that I've got the placement of these highlights and shadows accurate. So here between the eyes, that's going to show where the skull starts to slope up before it curves over the top of the head. These placements of those main highlights and shadows are crucial for enhancing that shape and form, and therefore more realism in our graphite drawings. Now the base layer stage here is something that I would never rush over. This is crucial for me, and I want to be making sure that I have got this just right before I start enhancing this with my graphite pencils. Now the other reason I love using graphite powder is because this actually is giving me that initial softness that would take many hours to achieve with graphite pencils on their own. So the graphite powder layer here is something that I do incorporate in any of my graphite drawings, regardless if I am going to be adding more detail on top later. Now when I start working with my pencils, this is where preventing those additional harsher details is something that I want to be emphasising throughout each stage. Now there are a couple of ways to do this. The first is to make sure that you're using the right pencil technique, and this is something that I do cover in the real-time version of this tutorial. It's recorded with a voiceover while I'm drawing, so everything is explained in the moment and it makes it very step by step. If this or any of my other real-time tutorials are of interest, I'll link all of the information to those in the description below. Now back to the graphite pencils, and as you can see here, I am hinting at my fur direction, but all of my pencil strokes are softer than something that was going to be of a drier fur texture. I've got lots of different examples of those here on YouTube. Now one thing that I'm going to be making sure of here is that the point of my pencil is not super sharp. This is the first thing that I feel is going to make a massive impact. If that pencil is too sharp, we're automatically going to be hinting at more defined detail than we want for something like this. Now the other thing here that makes a big difference is that I'm not jumping to my darkest pencils too soon. I'm making sure to build this up in many individual stages. Now as I start working with my lighter pencils, my harder leaded pencils, this is a 2H, I'm actually working on the edges of those darker sections that I've put in with my graphite powder. Now as you can see here, the more that I use these pencils and start to go up in those darker shades, this is now going to be a HB and then progress into a 2B, I want to be focusing on the softness between the lights and the darks, and those edges in particular. Now what this is going to do is aid with the level of softness, and as I've mentioned already in this video many times, it's the softness here that's more important than lots of individual fine pencil details. Now as I continue to build my darker layers in stages, you can see here that by enhancing that contrast and the lights and the darks, this is starting to take on more shape and form. Now each time I move my hand out the way and I'm moving that piece of glassine, which is that semi-translucent sheet of paper under my hand, that prevents smudging or the oils of your skin coming into contact with your drawing, you can see that the left side is far more realistic now that I'm enhancing those values compared to the graphite powder layer on the right. But one thing here that has those similarities between the two very different processes is still that softness. Now when I feel like I've established enough of my darker mid-tone stages, this is when I can start to put in more of my highlights. Now again, the highlights and the erasers that I'm using here need to make sure they're incorporating that softness. I don't want to jump straight into a Tombow mono eraser for something like this and end up creating too many harsh individual highlights. It's only now that I'm beginning to use that Tombow mono eraser over the top of my putty erasers. Now the way that we're going to layer the erasers, it is going to be very individual to each reference photo that we're working from. If there is more of a harsher highlight, then the putty eraser is probably not the best choice. But again, this is something that I do cover thoroughly in all of my real-time tutorials. Now another consideration is whether we should be using blending tools throughout the layering process in order to enhance the softness. Now there are many ways to get to the same end. It's one of the wonderful things about creating art. But for this drawing, I felt that creating softness with the graphite pencils worked better. I had more control over that blending rather than using, for example, a paper blending stump over the top. Now when I am using this eye makeup applicator again, I'm only trying to make that graphite powder base layer go right up to the outer edge after I had removed my sketch line. I'm not using that to blend the layers of graphite pencil. Now if you do want to use blend-in tools over the top of layers like this, something to really consider is not to over-blend. If I did need to pull in some more softness, then I wouldn't hesitate to use a paper blending stump or here an eye makeup applicator again, but I would always be trying to make sure that I am aware of how soft I need that layer to be. Because what has been achieved here with the softening of the graphite pencil layers, because of how I've got the point of my pencil, how I'm holding and using the pencil, this already looks soft. If I was to then use blending tools on top, it would then overblend within seconds. So here, because I'm focusing more on the pencil technique to achieve this softness, I don't need to use the blending tools on top. Now I feel by using the graphite pencils to actually create this softness throughout that layering process, it creates more of that balance of the impression of detail and that there is that indication of fur direction, but that it still looks soft. Now if I was to be using more of a sharper pencil, for example, and then use my blending tools over the top to try to soften the edges that way, depending on how sharp that pencil is and other factors such as how much pressure is applied to the pencil, how you're holding the pencil and so on, that is still going to make those details look harsh even if they are blended over the top. You potentially might end up with a pencil stroke that looks more wiry than you initially intended. So that is just why I preferred to use my graphite pencils here to enhance that softness with each layer I added. Now, one last thing that I want to mention regarding all of this is even though I'm creating the softness with my pencils, I am still following the direction of that fur and the length of that fur. Now, the area here around the nose, the fur would have been significantly shorter, potentially even just skin before the fur starts over the side of the cheeks. So in order to capture that, this is here on the muzzle area more about shading rather than actually creating any length to the pencil strokes. So maybe using smaller circles whilst you're using that pencil will help just to create more of that softness, but indicate more importantly at that fur being shorter on other areas of the face or the body. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to draw along to the real-time step-by-step version of this graphite drawing, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. If you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.